The axioms of existence: boundaries, ego, and the fractal of selfhood. At every level of existence, we see the same fundamental pattern emerge. A boundary is drawn to separate inside from outside, establishing a dynamic of attraction and repulsion to maintain that separation. Whether it's a cell, an individual, a city, or a nation, this boundary is both a means of survival and a source of conflict. The drive to maintain an inside distinct from the outside leads to behaviors that reinforce the boundary, selecting what to let in, what to expel, and what to guard against. In Buddhism, this is the realm of avidya, or ignorance, where we act in ways that support and reinforce a sense of separate self. And just as this closed circuit of I versus not I operates within individuals, it scales up fractally, creating larger collective egos in the form of families, tribes, city-states, and nations. The concept of ego, then, is not merely personal, but is reflected at every level of our societies and beliefs, even in our conception of the divine as a super-self, with qualities like jealousy and exclusive identity. This fractal pattern of selfhood demonstrates the mechanics of existence. Wherever there is a boundary, there is a need for control, defense, and persistence against change. The axiom of boundaries, separating inside from outside life at its most fundamental, requires a boundary, a skin, a wall, a membrane. This boundary defines an inside, a space where conditions can be controlled, protected, and optimized for survival. A cell membrane, for instance, is semi-permeable, allowing certain nutrients in while keeping out harmful substances. It also expels waste to maintain internal equilibrium. This basic axiom of needing an inside distinct from the outside gives rise to the fundamental drives of attraction, bringing in what's needed, and repulsion, keeping out or expelling what's harmful. These are the basic forces of greed and hate, drawn from the drive to preserve the boundary and maintain the conditions necessary for survival. The closed loop of inside versus outside is inherently ignorant of a greater interconnected reality. It only knows what must be done to sustain its separate existence. In this sense, existence itself is an act of self-defense against dissolution, a clinging to a center that resists the flow of constant change. The ignorant circle of I, ego as a microcosm of separation. For human beings, the mind forms its own boundary, crafting a psychological self or ego to protect and reinforce a sense of personal identity. Just like a cell, the ego determines what is me and not me. Experiences, preferences, and memories are internalized, while opposing ideas or external threats are rejected. The ego's boundaries are reinforced through attraction and aversion, constantly pulling in validation, success, and recognition, while pushing away criticism, failure, and discomfort. In Buddhism, this is avidya, ignorance, and tanha, craving, the driving forces of samsara, the cycle of suffering. The ego is blind to its own impermanence and interdependence, clinging to a static identity that is ultimately illusory. This ignorance fuels the desire for stability and self-protection, leading to greed and aversion, the ego's natural defense mechanisms. The ego constructs a fortress of beliefs, values, and defenses to guard against the dissolution of its boundaries, believing that this self must persist against the constant flux of change. The fractal scaling of ego, from individual to state. Just as individuals build an ego, societies build larger versions of the ego to protect and sustain themselves. A city or nation, like an individual, has boundaries that define its inside and outside, and it defends these borders with the same impulses of attraction and repulsion. Just as a person amasses wealth and resources, a nation accumulates territory, power, and influence, defending these acquisitions against perceived threats. The collective ego, like the individual ego, defines itself through a boundary of us and them, creating a shared identity that must be preserved. In a nation, this manifests as expansionist policies, resource hoarding, and military defense. In an individual, it manifests as ambition, competition, and exclusion. And in religion, it manifests as doctrines of exclusivity and divine wrath against unbelievers. Each level of ego operates under the same axiomatic mechanics, defining a boundary, guarding that boundary, and reinforcing it through greed, attraction, and hate, repulsion. This closed circle sustains itself through ignorance, refusing to acknowledge the greater reality of interdependence and change. The cycle of suffering, fractals of ego in perpetual defense. At every level, from the smallest cell to the largest empire, the cycle of suffering emerges from this self-reinforcing structure of ego. Each unit, individual, city, state, or God, clings to its own persistence, fearing dissolution, change, and the erosion of boundaries. This clinging leads to conflict, isolation, and suffering, as each ego resists the natural flow of impermanence and interconnectedness. The fractal nature of ego means that this pattern replicates itself at every scale. When individuals create nations, they expand the same egoic principles to encompass a collective identity, magnifying the same impulses of greed and hate. When nations create religions, they project these principles onto a divine plane, casting God as the ultimate ego who reinforces their separateness and exclusivity. Each layer of the fractal reinforces the next, creating a vast, self-sustaining structure of ignorance and resistance to change. Awakening from the fractal ego, embracing the reality of interdependence. To break free from this fractal structure of ego requires a fundamental shift in perception. Buddhism offers a path of prajna, or wisdom, that sees through the illusion of separateness and recognizes the interdependent nature of all things. By dissolving the boundary between inside and outside, we come to see that there is no fixed self, only a dynamic, interconnected process that is always in flux. This understanding dismantles the foundation of greed and hate as we realize that there is no me to protect or expand. In recognizing our interdependence, we transcend the need to defend or aggrandize the self, whether personal or collective. We can then relate to others, not as threats or competitors, but as parts of the same vast web of existence. As we dissolve our individual ego, we also begin to dissolve the collective egos of society and nation. We see that boundaries, while useful, are ultimately arbitrary and should serve connection, not division. In realizing the interconnected reality, we can begin to dismantle the structures of conflict and fear that arise from the fractal ego. Only by seeing beyond the illusion of selfhood at every level can we embrace a reality that is fluid, open, and free from suffering. This shift in understanding allows us to envision a different kind of world, one where cooperation replaces competition and compassion replaces defense. The path to this awakening is a gradual process of dismantling the layers of ego, from the personal to the collective, and ultimately to the divine. It is a path that reveals the truth of interdependence, dissolving the need for boundaries and revealing a reality beyond the spectacle of ego.